this film, I'll present some basic application of microeconomics, basically constructing the demand-supply curve and what we call the equilibrium price. I will illustrate and show the so-called welfare optimum and the understanding of economic efficiency, which is applied by economists in many circumstances. Also the way economists measure welfare, which is by applying the so-called consumer and producer surplus. And then finally, we will try to apply these concepts in a small model of trade of electricity between two local markets or two different market areas. Firstly, we move into the demand curve, and demand curve shows the relationship between prices and quantity demand by consumers. Basically, the lower the price, the higher demand for a given good. Basically, a relationship between prices and quantity demanded. So the lower the price, the higher quantities demanded by consumers. So, for example, if the price is P3, as illustrated in the figure, the demanded good will be Q3. The demand curve also shows or reflects the willingness to pay for the good by consumers, because consumers, firstly, has different willingness to pay because a good provide different levels of utility to different individuals, but also it reveals or reflects as more quantity demanded, the lower the price you are willing to pay, basically. So this is the individual or the demand curve for individuals. We also, as economists, says that it reflects the utility of a certain good, because given that you are willing to pay a certain price for a good, this must be equal to your utility of consuming the good. Then we talk about two things. We talk about a movement along the demand curve and a movement of the demand curve. Firstly, we look at the movement along the demand curve, because if prices in this example decreases from P star to P1, the consumers are willing to increase the consumption from Q star to Q1, or the other way around, an increase in price from P star to P2, consumption will decrease by from Q star to Q2. So this basically shows what happens in terms of quantity demanded by changes in the price. A movement along the demand curve or of the demand curve is can illustrate in this way. For example, what we talk about here is changes in other variables, for example, substituting goods or the income of the individuals. In this situation, we have a decrease in price of a substituting good, meaning that we can expect an increase in demand of the substituting good, and for that reason, the demand for this good will decrease. And this is illustrated by a leftward shift of the demand curve. The other or the opposite picture is an increase in the substituting good, which might decrease the demand curve or the demand for this good, and this is illustrated by a shift in the demand curve to the right. And it can be all kind of variables that are changing the demand curve. It can be income, total income for individuals, or as I said, the price of a substituting good. What is a substituting good? Well, it's not clear cut, but some would argue that green apples and red apples might be substituting goods. For some individuals, it's substituting goods. For other individuals, it's not. But on the average and everything equal, as we say as economists, we might expect some kind of change in demand curve of, let's say, red apples if the price in green apples change. Moving to the supply curve, which is the let's say the opposite picture of the situation. The supply curve illustrates combinations of prices and quantities a company or the market is willing to supply. If the price increase, the willingness to supply also increases. The supply curve is typically a function of prices of this particular good, also the price of the factor input, which can be labor, variable input or capital. If this is a supply curve for electricity market, the variable input could be coal, gas, and so on. And as we move up along the supply curve and prices increases, more expensive generators can be taken into account in the supply of demand. So basically, because we assume perfect competition in this setting, this supply curve will also reflect the marginal cost of generation. Because, and that's what I'm stating now, I will not prove it, but in a perfect competition setting, the best strategy for suppliers is to have a supply curve reflecting the marginal cost of operation. Again, we can also move along the supply curve and we can move the supply curve. So, for example, if we have an increase in the cost of the variable input, a gas price increase, as we've seen this year, 2022, this will move the supply curve upwards. A parallel shift according to the shift in the gas price, for example. And this will increase the price to P2 we need an increase in price to P2 in order to be willing to supply Q star. As we will see in a little while, the market price might not increase to P2 due to some elasticity in demand. And then we move into the equilibrium of the supply and demand curve, and the equilibrium is actually created where these curves intersect each other. So please notice that there is a balance in the market, and this balance is not created by any central coordination. It actually through the market prices. The price is, as I say, the glue that binds together the buying and selling of the parties, the market players in a market. And by this piece of information, the price, we will reach an equilibrium. This diagram is what we call a partial equilibrium diagram, because we only consider this particular good, which in this case could be electricity, holding the income and the prices of all other goods fixed. And again, why is this an equilibrium? Well, put shortly, it's an equilibrium because only at that price, P star, we have a balance between demand and supply, total demand and total supply in this market. If we, for example, consider the price of P1, P1 could be a minimum price supplied or guaranteed for suppliers. how would that play out in a market? Well, if the price was P1, the supplier was willing to would be willing to supply Q1, but because the price P1 is higher than the equilibrium price, the consumers is only willing to consume Q1 prime. And in this case, we have what we call excess supply. There is a gap between demand and supply, where the supply is higher than demand. So in this situation, if we, let's just for the sake of the example, removed the minimum price of P1, what would happen? Well, the market forces would create some kind of movement towards the equilibrium, because consumers with a high willingness to pay or willingness to pay below P1 but above P star would of course try to find and match with the suppliers which is also willing to supply below P1 but above P star. So we would see some kind of movement towards the equilibrium. And the opposite picture is if we, let's say, assume some kind of a maximum price. Maximum prices is applied in different markets for different reasons, mainly to protect consumers. But what would happen in this situation? A maximum price of P2 would entail that consumers would be willing to consume a Q2, but suppliers will only be willing to provide and supply Q2 prime. So in this situation, we have what we call excess demand, because demand is higher than supply. And again, what happens if we removed this max price? Well, again, suppliers and consumers would try to meet each other because their willingness to pay will be matched with this willingness to supply, and this movement will go on until we reach the equilibrium price P star and Q star. And let's see what happens if we increase, for example, the cost of generation. If this is the supply curve for electricity market, and the cost of generation increases. Well, firstly, we move the supply curve vertically in line with the cost increase. Now, in order to supply Q star, the generators should receive a settlement price of P prime, but this settlement price is not an equilibrium because the price is higher, or the price will not balance the market, because at this price P prime, the suppliers would be willing to supply Q star, but the consumers will only be willing to consume a lower amount. So we need some kind of adjustment in the market in order to have a new balance or a new equilibrium, which is P star prime and Q star prime. So what we see is that the total increase in cost cannot be imposed on the consumers. Only part of the cost will be imposed on consumers. Then if we move into the electricity market and take a look at how our prices are calculated, basically what I do here is to take the European approach as a point of departure, but it happens in this way in all kinds of electricity markets worldwide. Basically, prices and the market is facilitated in some kind of power exchange, and this power exchange is the market operator, and the power exchange asks producers and consumers to supply bids to this marketplace. In Europe nowadays, what we supply is hourly bids, so we have 24 prices and schedules being calculated each hour for the coming day, and this is an illustration of the individual supply curves from the different producers in the market. Also, we have the different demand curves for consumers, and the power exchange does just as in the microeconomic textbook, put these curves together and create a market supply and a market demand, and then, as we just illustrated, finding the price where these curves intersect. So this is basically the task for the market operator, to calculate prices and schedules hour by hour based on the bids from the generators. And again, if we assume perfect competition, what we have here is a market supply reflecting the marginal cost of generators, meaning that in order to cover the load at this level, we will ramp up the cheap generators before we move into more expensive generators. And this is what engineers call the mirror order dispatch of generation. Economists call it market supply or marginal cost of operation. Basically the same. And if we take a more detailed look at the price electricity market, then the price in this particular market is very important in order to create a balance between demand and supply. We saw in the previous slides that the price will balance demand and supply, but in this particular market, this is very important because in the electricity market, we do not have such a thing as storage yet, at least not at a reasonable cost. We do have batteries, but the cost of a battery in terms of storage capacity is very expensive, and we do not have batteries that can, let's say, create a balance in or smooth out the demand over a day. So we need the price as an alternative to storage to create the balance, and that is what is illustrated in this figure. For example, if we take what we call price A, you have a situation of high demand, could be the peak hours of day. In this particular hour, there's not a lot of wind in the power system, so for that reason, the price will intersect at what we call price A. As an alternative is, for example, there was more wind in the system, higher generation by wind turbines, which can be illustrated as a movement of the supply curve to the right. We can see that the price will decrease to a new equilibrium. And that's the way it works in the electricity market. So in case of low wind and high demand, there's no storage where we can, let's say, take our electricity in order to cover the load. We need the price as the balancing mechanism. So we need to increase the price in order for some consumers to go out of the market and not consume, and hereby creating the balance between demand and supply. This is the, let's say, most important role of the price in the electricity market.